Greetings and salutations, friends. Welcome to another Project the Show episode. We stopped counting a long time ago. We actually have a very special episode today. We have two guests, DA and Soumya. I'm gonna share a little bit of their bio, of who they are and why they're here. But we're really grateful. The format of today's episode is going to be a little bit different. It's probably going to be a little bit longer than usual, but it's incredibly important, and we're super proud of this episode. So please don't fast forward. Stick through the whole thing. I think there's going to be some very good and informative stuff in there. So our first guest is DA Dirks. DA is a Canadian. DA is a contract faculty in the Department of Humanities at General Education at Mount Royal University. They primarily teach courses that examine diverse genders, sexualities, and identities. DA was a senior academic planner at the University of Wisconsin System Administration, the coordinator of student organizations for social justice, and LGBT Resource Center at Northwestern University. Also, DA was a coordinator of LGBT student services at Western Michigan University. DA served as educational chair and co-chair for the Consortium of Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals. DA was also the chair of the Diversity of Equal Committee of the Mount Royal Faculty Association. DA has facilitated workshops on LGBTQ2+ human rights, racial justice, and social justice at universities, high schools, and nonprofit organizations like the November Project. DA was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease in 2017 as navigating the challenges of living with this chronic illness.
DA!
Yeah, round of applause for DA, round of applause. Soumya Palreddy is an advocate, licensed psychologist, and trainer. Bringing warmth and energy, she provides technical assistance and promotes transformative change in areas of healthcare disparities, racism, gender inequity, workplace climate, and supervision. Her journey facilitating changes in communities started with planning and implementing prevention programming at Rape Crisis Center. It was in this capacity where she discovered her love of teaching, connecting people with one another, and creating curricula that is engaging, challenging, and inclusive. Currently, Soumya is a national trainer for Mental Health First Aid USA, a medical consultant for Social Security Administration, and curriculum developer for statewide peer support program. Soumya served as associate director at University Healthcare Services, University of Wisconsin-Madison, sitting on the leadership team for the mental health division. She also had served as adjunct faculty at University of Wisconsin-Madison and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, headed an assignment clinic and nonprofit organization, and provided mental health first aid trainings to local communities and school districts. I don't know about you, but I'm sweaty just reading all this impressive bio material.
The years of work.
The years of work.
Well,
and basically,
Soumya is much younger than me, and so is therefore much more successful. So she's much more impressive.
To summarize, you two are really fucking impressive. And the reason we like you and we're working with you is that you have a very unique understanding of November Project, because both of you are longtime members of November Project. DA, have I missed anything about Soumya?
Well, I met Soumya running up Bascom Hill in Madison, Wisconsin at a November Project workout in 2014 when she was, let us say, quite large with child. And I saw her sort of waddling up Bascom Hill, and I thought, this is a person I really want to get to know, because she's out here working out and is going to have a baby any second. And so that must mean that she is a badass. And I was right. She is a badass.
Soumya, anything to say about DA that I haven't mentioned?
You know, DA's bio has not mentioned their wicked sense of humor, which will come out in our time together. But in addition to their amazing heart, their humor and placement of humor is spot on. So excited for that to come out.
Well, we're incredibly excited and privileged to have you here. Like I said, this show is going to take a little bit more serious turn than usual, but I think it's well worth it, and we're very proud of it. So, DG, why don't you take it away?
I would love to talk just really briefly about why DA and Soumya are part of this equation. The backstory is that we've been working with these two for technically only a couple years, less than that even, getting ready for last year's leadership training called the Meeting of the Minds. But both DA and Soumya go many, many years before that back, like DA mentioned, being involved with November Project Madison, and jump in either of you, but like the first time that one or both of you approached to offer help in what you do professionally for this morning passion community group that you're involved with personally, what, 5, 6, 7 years ago? So it dates back.
That credit goes to DA. DA is also incredibly persistent, and any opportunity that they saw Brogan and Boyan would like sneak on up and say, hey, so let's have a conversation here.
And it wasn't a lot of sneaking.
Hi.
They snuck one time, and from then on, it was a lot of.
It was like, hello, here's my face.
It was a human roadblock a lot of times. But there is something about being of the community that Boyan mentioned. But the next piece is offering help. You know, this is a vast community of a lot of different skills that we never really learned too much about necessarily at the workouts. And so to have both Dia and Soumya offer, that was incredibly important. The piece that they are both from this community, I think it took our first step as a group of 5 on these calls, getting ready for the meeting of the minds with all of our leaders last summer in Seattle, from a place of trust. Both DA and Soumya understand the culture of November Project and what's really great about it, and a lot of the kind of loopholes and the gaps in what we're doing. And so the last piece I wanted to talk about and give you like your final round of props before this conversation begins is the fact that DA and Soumya are just smarter than us. And what I mean by that is we all bring a lot to the table, but their professional and personal experience navigating through this world, as well as their connection at November Project, puts them both in a position where right away we're willing just to listen. And I think that's a lot of what this conversation hopefully will be, is just guiding and understanding and letting these two speak, talking about the things that matter to us, and the first outward-facing kind of conversation of this sort.
Yeah, so DA and Soumya, I would just love to start with kind of leading up to Seattle, the 2019 Meeting of the Minds, which is the leadership summit we have where we fly all the leaders, and just the homework assignments that you gave us, the readings, and like kind of how you formatted where are the areas of focus that you wanted to present on.
I can start, and DA, please interrupt and interject. So one of the things that I like, the positionality that Brogan talked about and Boyan talked about and you talked about, Laura. So as members, we knew, you know, what it was like from that experience. And yet we know that the leaders are in this unique role. And so we wanted to tap into their expertise and their experience to hear about what were some of the challenges, gaps, misses that they had as leaders in leading November Project workouts. And so that was one of the critical components that we did, is we put together a survey to try to hear, where do you think that you've shined as a leader? Where are pieces that have missed and have not landed well, and that you wish you could kind of go back and redo? And we used some of that information then to catapult the homework assignments that we gave.
I mean, I also think that as members of November Project Madison, and as people who, I think both of us are empathetic listeners, we heard a lot of things going on within the group that we, like, I don't know, we gave advice, we gave support to individual members as well as co-leaders, because we, I think, as I said, are empathetic listeners. And so we knew sort of some of the things that were also happening on the ground with people who were part of November Project and some of the challenges and struggles that they were going through as well. So we didn't come at it as leaders, but we came at it as members who were very committed to the group. And so we read through some of the feedback that leaders gave us, and there were a couple of things that we sort of thought might be helpful bits of homework for them before we met up together in person. And one of those was an article that talked about, instead of calling out, calling people in, right? When people make mistakes, and we're all human and we all make mistakes. So how do you address some of those things that are said or done that are problematic, but doing it in a way that shows some compassion instead of just canceling somebody? So that was one of the things that we thought would be important to consider and talk about. And the other one was a conversation that we'd been having for a while about the issue of calling November Project groups tribe, right? And so the word tribe, we'd heard some feedback about that in terms of the challenges around that word and maybe some of why it was sitting in an uncomfortable way with folks. And so we wanted to dig into that as well. And so we had leaders do a reading and have a conversation about the word tribe. So those were the bits of homework that we did leading up to Mom in 2019.
From one thing that I want to add from a design perspective, when we're thinking about how do we change organizational norms, all three, Laura, Boyan, and Brogan, were really adamant that it shouldn't be like a one and done. So DA and I come in and then we like talk at people and then we leave. And so that was some of the intention behind having those homework assignments, is giving people an opportunity to chew through the material, figure out what sits well, what doesn't, and then be able to bring those perspectives when we met in person.
And a little bit of a historical significance there. The year before that, brought in the speaker. We did not prepare well enough our leaders that the speaker will be there to come in prepared, ready to listen, be prepared to listen on the topics that the speaker was preparing to talk about. So it felt a little bit disjointed and convoluted, and the leaders just didn't put themselves in the right space. So by providing these resources ahead of time before the meeting in Seattle, we gave the leaders time, months ahead of time, to prepare for these meetings, to have the conversation either amongst themselves, to already start thinking about it. So when they do sit in front of you two, it doesn't seem like it's coming out of that field. It's natural, and they're prepared to put themselves in that space.
And so then there was also follow-up post meeting of the minds, and then that was revving up for 2020, which unfortunately was canceled, but postponed. But so then in Seattle, we were able to perform a few activities together. The first one being the identity grid, and then we made the community agreements together. Can you kind of give us a little summary of what those were?
I've done work, as was said in my bio, with nonprofits and schools for a while. And, for when I first started getting into leadership development in particular, when I was working at Western Michigan University, we would do these activities exercises, which were kind of like cross the line exercise, like take a step forward if you have this, take a step back if you have this. And what I found after doing those, this again was like, a dozen years ago, was that it often left people feeling kind of lousy, right? To have to do that kind of public showing of what your positionality was, and it wasn't necessarily really addressing the complications of identity. And so over time, I rely on other people to give me advice too and feedback. I had seen something like this identities grid and thought, well, this is actually maybe better because it sort of talks about the intersectionality of people's identities, which can be variable and complicated. And in some places you might have privileges, and in some place you might lack privilege. And so it gets, and how people perceive us versus how we see ourselves, it really gets better, I think, at the complications of social identities, instead of doing like a crossing the line exercise. And so I've done it with nonprofit groups and schools. I've also done it in my classrooms when I've taught courses where it's relevant to doing an exploration of social identities. And you get rich conversations out of it, as well as people self-reflect, and then as they also talk to other people. So I've found it to be a helpful activity where people they tend to open up more than sort of throw up roadblocks to say, well, I'm a white cisgender male, I have all the privilege, I'm not going to talk about this because now I immediately feel uncomfortable and or defensive. It gets much more at the complications of identities, I think, and people are much more willing to open up as a result.
And one of the kind of learning objectives of that identity, social identity grid, was that you can't talk about leadership and culture and how we make change without reflection. And so creating adequate time and space, which we ran out of time, but we wanted to create that jumping off point for people to reflect and start to have some of the language of, why does this interaction feel slightly different? Why does this one feel rich? Why am I connecting? Where do I need to learn and grow? So those were some of the learning objectives we hoped that would start to emerge for the leaders.
The community agreements, I know BG kind of wanted to talk a little bit about too, which was We also did a conversation about sexual violence, and was there one more that I'm missing? I think those are the main 3 ones, but the community agreements were made by all the co-leaders, and which was this incredible engagement of thought and process. But BG, you want to talk a little bit more about where we took it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of working with DA and Soumya leading up to, and then in live time in Seattle with 125 leaders, like the whole thing was extremely powerful. But in those weeks leading up, I just remember the conversation where the 5 of us were saying, you know, what if we made these kind of borders or these rules or the lay of the land or whatever the language. And Soumya, you were the first one to say, of course, in a very Soumya way, what I'm hearing you say is this idea of community agreements. And it was the first time I'd ever heard it. But like Laura said, you know, it was how our members should expect to participate or act or be under what kind of, I don't want to say laws, but it was the idea of the rules of the road for November Project. And if it sounds loose, it was then, because it was just things that we had expected of people. And so to have our leaders all in one room up there on the 25th floor of that skyscraper in Seattle, it was a really cool opportunity to say, let's get these down. Let's get these down on paper. And DA and Soumya led us through that exercise. It's just words though. And so the idea of taking these words from all of these leaders in these small groups, condensing them and defining them into these 6 community agreements, I mean, there may not be a more important blog post that we've ever put out. And what we did with that was to put a voice to it. We thought, especially in a day and age where social media gets people's attention, we wanted to share this out with our members. Of course, that's the point. It's just to start to have these expectations built by our leaders through their experiences, and of course, with the help of DA and Soumya. So back here in Minneapolis, we asked one of the co-leaders, Nat, to go through the 6 community agreements. She's very well spoken and was one of the presenters actually at the Meeting of the Minds, and just walked the audience looking into the camera. This whole thing was just shot on a phone, of what each one of them stands for and what they mean, and not necessarily getting into super definition, but reading them and giving a voice to it. For those of you who've seen it, it's just pretty crystal clear, but that was the way in which we were sharing it out. It's been really cool to see, you know, it's not like it's written and held up at the beginning of every workout, but it's something that a lot of our leaders revisit, at least on a monthly. And as far as November Project HQ, we refer to it definitely every week, helping us make decisions. And so, you know, one of the very cool examples was the folks up at November Project Canada. They call themselves Canada, but it's Edmonton, which is in Alberta.
Yeah, I noticed that. And as somebody from Calgary.
Those are both cities in Alberta, and there's some tension there. Okay, but what they did was they walked through all of the community agreements, and they used their ability to write a blog, which usually just recaps the workout, and they used the themes from each workout to talk about these agreements, to talk about what each of them means. Nadeem, one of the longtime leaders, wrote in, I think, their 2nd or 3rd workout, this blog post about blurring the lines and this conversation around identity and diversity, which I think is something that we're going to continue to work on over the months and years to come with the November Project. But if you have time, searching Blurring the Lines on our website. And I think that's a nice segue.
In the description, we can add the link.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue into talking more about identity.
Before you talk more about identity, I don't think that we actually really explained why we decided to go with community agreements. Why was it important to put this together, to spend, you know, a few hours of our leaders' times in Seattle to put this together?
Yeah, I mean, once we're off the script, I mean, conversationally, you know, I think it was a lot of follow your gut, what makes sense, be a good person. I think it was a lot of safety first, definitely, and a lot of assumptions. November Project started as a group of friends and people that were connected to you and I, and it had grown so big that this idea of passing down leadership, it was nearly solid across the board, but it started to extend too far. And so this idea of if a new leader came on and said, hey, what do we do about this? Or what do we do about that? We needed to have some laws. We needed to have some rules. And our organizations never made sense for you and I, or for the 3 of us, or even the 5 of us to say, these are the rules. So instead, we wanted it to come from the leaders and their combined dozens or hundreds of years of experience.
Having all our leaders be involved in creating that document was, it seemingly, once you kind of read through all those things, it's like, yeah, obviously, duh, those are very reasonable things. But unless you write those down, you can't really enforce if someone kind of starts zigging when they're supposed to zap, right?
And I want to give us a little bit of the when we brought this idea up, it's because we were looking at, so it's again like leader driven, that we were looking at that survey and some of the uncertainty and the missed opportunities. We were looking at the results together, and then DA said, you know, it seems like November Project needs a community agreement. And so even though in the meeting I voiced the idea that DA brought up, it was from the leaders' survey responses saying, I'm not sure if I did this correctly. I don't know what I should have done there. I think I did this okay. And that common theme coming up to then create these community agreements that serve as not only values for the members and leaders, but also boundaries. And even though boundaries are not the same as walls, boundaries are there to help us interact safely. And so that it clearly is, that was the intention for it, and it's coming to fruition in that way.
DA, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, so like, again, when I started doing these kinds of workshops around inclusion, diversity, racial justice, social justice, LGBTQ justice, we used to put up ground rules and say, like, these are the ways that you should behave. Is there anything that people would like to add? And over time, it felt like that was too, rules just didn't feel right. And it was more then also like, what do we as a community agree to? Like, what are our community agreements versus here are the ground rules?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think to distinguish what community agreements are versus ground rules is important as well, because it's much more collaborative then. It's done by people in the community. It's generative that way, instead of like, I'm going to tell you what the rules are. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important distinction as well, is that they're really community agreements. They're not rules, ground rules, or the law. So
I did want to kind of go back though into the identity grid. It's something that has stuck with me, and a lot of the leaders, we still reference it all the time. Wayne, you want to dive into that?
Yeah, why is it important to talk about, to do the exercise of the identity if we want to understand the people? We're saying, and from the day one we've been saying that we're inclusive. All you need to do is just put a pair of shoes and come out, like just show up. Obviously that has been our tagline. We've been saying that we're inclusive, but once we start kind of peeling back the onion a little bit, we start realizing, well, there is a massive, Laura makes fun of me that I overuse that word, but there is.
We all have a favorite word. We all have a favorite word.
Massive. There is a lot of things that we do, and then there's a lot of things that we don't do, that even though we say we are inclusive, there are things that we're doing not intentionally, but just by making certain decisions, we're preventing a large groups of people from coming to November Project. So in order for us to be more inclusive, we have to look at ourselves and understand who we are as leaders of this movement, as people in all our respective geographical, geopolitical locations, and to, based on those, kind of like, once we look ourselves in the mirror, we're going to have better understanding of the privileges that we have or don't have, and where we need to, and the spaces that we need to address and the spaces that we need to improve.
Right. So yeah. So I was saying it really influenced me, but it was sitting down and like actually looking at a piece of paper and writing out who I am as a person. I wouldn't say it was like eye-opening, but it kind of was, and like just sitting and reflecting on the privileges that I have, which, boy, and I'm just piggybacking on kind of what he was saying. But when we like go back to the inception of November Project, and looking back on it now, and you just see all the blind spots we had. We all three of us graduated. We have an education, we're white, we're straight, and we were recruiting people to join us who were like us. And we came at it with such an aggressive, competitive nature. And if you look at the co-leaders across the board, especially the first few years, they were our friends, they were our teammates. And so this unconscious bias of not only who was coming to our workouts, but who we were helping us grow this thing. It was essentially people who all identified very similarly. And so I think we tried so hard over the years to evolve November Project to be more inclusive, but I think a majority of our attention, and maybe because it was safer and more familiar to us, went towards people of different physical abilities and fitness levels, but we really failed in terms of diversifying in race and ethnicity and other categories, maybe because it was uncomfortable for us. And now looking back, it's embarrassing for me, but I think that's part of the growth, hopefully. Shame, no, but so we, looking at that chart, I think the grid and with all the co-leaders around and just realizing like, okay, this is like, these are the privileges that we have, and our whiteness has gotten us, and this is how we travel through the world, and this is how it affects our leadership. And so, and just kind of like not backpedaling, but figuring out how to go forward and take these lessons with us was incredibly valuable. So thank you for that exercise.
I'm so appreciative of you sharing that, Laura, because I know we did that in like little pods or pairings. And so I wasn't your partner. We were walking around to make sure that, you know, to answer any questions, but it takes a lot of guts to like look back and say like, oh, I wish I had done that a little bit differently. And I'm also appreciative of you sharing how maybe whiteness was centered, you know, in the expansion of November Project, in the creation of November Project, and how this kind of this work and this reflection is about kind of decentering some of that whiteness. And so thank you for sharing that.
I think, so we've talked about this before, right? I mean, lots of organizations like November Project start, you know, grassroots, you know, wasn't intending to be a global movement. It was like, let's get some workouts in with people we like and our friends. And so there's some of that. And then there's also, like you said, the unconscious bias of like, oh, we're going to contact people who are our friends who are quite similar to us. And so I think that makes sense in a lot of ways. And I've been involved with organizations that I think started out very small, didn't really have to account for a lot of these complications of identity or positionality, and then became larger. And then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but found themselves in the position of like, there's lots of things we didn't account for in terms of building our organization. And now we know we're excluding people who have minoritized identities, and how do we address it? And so November Project is, I would say, like many of the schools we went to were predominantly white campuses, predominantly white organization, where it's like, okay, well now how can we address some of our structural inequities? And it's a leap, it's hard work, but it's also important work to do, I think, given the world that we live in, right? And as Boyan, as you said, like, especially as a global phenomenon that November Project is now, there might be issues around identity that pertain to North America that don't pertain to parts of Europe or Asia, or, you know, there's global complications around identity, but I think some of the things that you can also find commonalities with people across identities as well. And so it's recognizing difference, it's acknowledging that difference exists and inequities exist, but then it's also like, how can we work across these to make this a better organization? So I think that's kind of how I see this work.
I mean, my identity is an immigrant, right? But also my appearance. And I think one of the things in that exercise that was really useful was what is important to you, and what do you think it's important to the society, or like what components of identity scale or kind of like grade this importance to you, and what's important to society. And so, for example, as an immigrant, that is in the woods of Vermont, that is a big part of my identity. And as BG said in one of the previous episodes, if I go back to Serbia, that kind of goes away. I'm Serbian in Serbia. That doesn't really matter. But if I look myself in a mirror, if I don't say a word, I just look like a 6'4" white guy with a shaved head and a beard. And just by looking the way I look, I carry a lot of privileges despite of all the other things. And for me, that exercise was incredibly useful because it reminded me that just because I feel certain things and just because my path to where I am today has not been one of, privilege. There have been things that definitely came easier than others. But now the way I look, the way I am, the way I'm positioned in society, I do definitely have a lot of privileges, and I have to recognize those and not get defensive about, well, I'm also an immigrant. That doesn't matter. It's a lot of people make assumptions without even hearing me speak, just based on how I look. And they do that across population around the world. And so I really appreciate that component of the exercise.
The exercise was delivered to this room of people coming at this work from many different places, and the way in which the two of you delivered it was so spot on, because it was approachable. This idea of, what do you push forward? Like, what are the things you're saying? Like, not so obviously like what's on your Instagram, but like, what are the things that you bring up? Who are you? And from there, it got into some of the more dynamic racial privileges, those things that are harder to talk about. And so it wasn't a trick, but it was very easy to enter into that exercise because I'm tall and I'm from Wisconsin, and I'll probably tell you that. And I was a rower in college. And then you get into things that are a little deeper. I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I'm very noticeably a white male. And with that comes a lot of privilege. And walking through that exercise, it was really, I should say, it was nearly impossible to not look at yourself in the mirror. And I think that was one of the important goals of that exercise. And for me, it was a really good lesson in paying attention to the way you're perceived and the things that you're pushing forward. And the things that, whether or not you're talking about them, they act as privileges no matter what. And I thought it was unique. It was cool to be on like the kind of the teacher side of it. I felt like I was really in the DA Soumya posse because I was like working with the two of you. But I know that Boyan and Laura and myself were able to preview the work, be a part of it, do it on our own, and we had our own grids and we're filling out that work that day. And the last thing I want to say about the identity work that we did was it really made it easy to talk about. Privileges or lack thereof is a hard thing just to have a chat next to the water cooler or you're waiting for the elevator. And I thought the tools were there to say, what things do you put forward? What don't I know about you? And just to read the audience from what little you know about them or what they're saying, and to get to know people. Like, that's another part of the identity workshop piece.
And I think so. And the interesting piece is Soumya and I are both children of immigrants, but people make certain assumptions about me that they might not necessarily make about Soumya, right? And so some of that is also based on the privilege of the whiteness of my skin, right? Because people think, oh, you've been here forever because you're white, not, oh, you must be the child of immigrants because, you know what I mean? So there's complications around positionality where, people will make certain assumptions. And it's like Boyan said, you don't have to open your mouth or say a word. People's brains are already working to put you in a box or to position you in a certain way, or to privilege you or disempower you in certain ways. And so I think that's all of that, I think, is important to discuss. Again, not speaking for you, Soumya, but touching on some of that commonality that we have, but also the differences of our experiences.
Right. Well, and one thing that I'm hearing across Boyan and Brogan and Laura's description is that it provided them some tools and hopefully the leaders a tool, and that's a byproduct of, if we don't know how to talk about something and we don't have the words for it, then the human kind of response is to not. And so if we create giving you some basic words, creating an opportunity for you to have a conversation with somebody, that's tools in your toolbox to be able to then create those opportunities later on. Because we often are silenced when we don't know what to do, and it's not out of an intention of wanting to do harm. It's like not knowing what to do, confusion. Am I going to do the right thing? Am I going to say the right thing? And so a byproduct of doing some of this reflection is giving some of those tools.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons we're actually recording this episode is to show that it is hard to talk about a lot of these things, and it is, but it's important to talk about these things. And we have been, for some time, have not been having these conversations publicly. That doesn't mean that they have not been happening in the background, but I think that we have large enough platform that as leaders of community, or if we want to call ourselves to be leaders of community, we need to have these conversations, and we need to be vulnerable to having these conversations, and we need to be willing to publicly fuck up and then own up to those fuck ups, because I think we can set an example for other people to have those conversations. I think we have that responsibility.
Laura, it really resonated when you were kind of jokingly said the word shame, because I refused to keep a journal like for most of my entire life, because I thought I would be like horrified at old Soumya, what she would have said. And so this reflection process is hard, because it is undoubtedly going to expose things that we could have done differently, we should have done differently, and it's going to expose the things that we kind of nailed on, that like we got it right. And so like there's beauty and it's twofold, but that shame piece, I would be like, oh, I cannot believe 6th grade Soumya wrote that. That's embarrassing and horrifying. And so that's a small way it showed up for me in journaling.
Yeah. Well, I think something that we're saying without saying it, I mean, is that we as an organization have been very quiet, and it's deafening, right? So and it's because we've been paralyzed by our whiteness, again, about like that white guilt and the fear of saying the wrong thing. And so we're done, we've moved on, we're ready to learn, and we're ready to make big changes. And so we're just like hopeful that the members of our workouts are going to come along with us.
Learning can be uncomfortable and painful, right? I mean, that's kind of the growth edges that you experience. And I say that to my students as well as myself, right? Like I'm not perfect. I'm not trying to put myself up here as like the expert of all things. I'm a facilitator of learning. And so there's going to be times where you're uncomfortable and you're going to feel dumb or inexpert or confused or resistant or upset. Like all of those things are normal things when you're learning, and growth takes, you need to take some of those uncomfortable steps in order to grow. For example, I just used the word dumb, which is not a good word to use because it has historical connotations about people who could not speak, and it's a pejorative word. So I shouldn't have used that word.
When DA fucks up, I love it. So go on record with that.
Well, so one of the things that we have been working on for years, actually, but most notably in the last year with the word tribe, is language, the language we're using, especially on social media, the language that we teach the leaders to use when they're in front of the group. Can I ask you just kind of about language in general, and like how maybe in history or just current events, like the power of language?
Yeah, I teach many classes where we talk about vocabulary and language and grammar. And so I use they, them pronouns, for example. And so, because I identify as being a non-binary transgender person, which I just taught a course at the University of Calgary, and one student was like, I don't know what that means. And so I was like, oh, right. So I don't identify with the sex I was assigned at birth, which means I'm transgender, and I'm non-binary because my sense of who I am is neither male nor female. So that's kind of who I am. And so I use they, them pronouns, and I talk about that with my students. And a lot of them immediately then are like, uh-oh, what do I call you? Like if I say the wrong thing, if I use she, her, you're going to be mad at me. So I'm just going to not engage with pronouns at all. So, it's a learning experience, right? I don't expect people to get my pronouns right all the time, but what I would like is for people to practice and try. And I think you can say that about a lot of words. Like language is changing. Words that we use today, we wouldn't have used maybe even a year ago or 5 years ago, certainly not 20 or 30 years ago, right? So language evolves, and that's okay, right? The world changes and language evolves along with it. And so you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Like, forgive yourself for that. Most people will also forgive you if you say a thing and it's and you catch yourself and you say, oh, I'm sorry. Great, you're sorry, let's move on, right? So some of that conversation around things like pronouns or about words that may have been popular a few years ago and aren't anymore, like it's a learning process. And again, some people might get defensive and some people might say, well, I use that word, or I think that word is okay to use. And even if you're a member of that community, to say like, it's okay for you to use tribe if you're an Indigenous person, and to say, well, other people can use the word tribe. That's great. But also, what's the consensus about that word, and how are people feeling about that word right now? And how has that word been used? And can we do better? Can we think about alternatives to a word that might cause some people to feel discomfort and to feel like they're not part of the group? So those are some of the things I tend to talk about.
As a psychologist and part of my training work, I talk a lot about language and mental health, and how we talk about mental health and people who are diagnosed with mental disorders, how we talk about it, and how stigma and kind of othering people can occur. And so in the real life implications, language plays a significant role in creating and keeping up. And so, and that extends far beyond just mental health. And so we, like DA said, we're constantly adding and subtracting and changing words to vocabulary. If that wasn't true, then we wouldn't have slang, right? And we know that people respond to that things are constantly shifting, changing. And there is some of that defensiveness that we push up against, where it feels like people are policing our language, or people are having a say over what comes out of our mouth. And conversations around the word tribe, again, I'm going to come back to what DA said, that there's roots to what that word, how it historically was created, how it's used, and then there's implications, there's fruits to when you use it. And so November Project having a thoughtful conversation around that is spot on. And and I know that conversation is going to continue, but really grateful that have had an opportunity to be a part of that conversation.
I mean, this could be a good time to transition into talking about the context of this word tribe, and how it fell into a workout group, like why, how that began. And I don't remember the original roots, but I will say that you start to hear this word tribe in marketing. It's like people are using it now, and they're using it to talk about community, and they're using it to replace a tight-knit group. And now there's an appropriate attention on it, way more than when Boyan and I had the nerve to invite people to the Harvard Stadium in the spring of 2012. And Boyan, jump in a second if I misstep the history here, but we were doing a lot of things really wacky and making it up, and we were screaming "fuck yeah," and we were saying November Project is a tribe of all kinds of athletes, and it was a true community, and it was about just showing up with no excuses. And don't say you're going to come and drop a verbal and don't come, or we'll put you on the "we missed you" page. Like, it was very brash and very bold, and it was very fun. It was a little cocky and overconfident, and it drove a lot of people to scratch their heads and say, I gotta experience this. And I think what we weren't seeing is that we were driving a lot of people away too, perhaps. But as it applies to the word tribe, we started exchanging that as almost a greeting. The tribe is strong, and we would say about November Project. And we didn't give it time. We didn't think about the historical relevance. And when we did, we thought, and Boyan, maybe jump in here, but there was a great energy around it. And we didn't feel like maybe we were offending anyone. And we just, like a lot of the things we were doing, and this is not an excuse. In fact, this is going to make me sound like an idiot, but this is part of the work. We didn't look at it like a lot of the things. We labeled the workout Frogman 1, and I brought a giant lamp that I found in the dumpster as an award for the fastest athlete that day. And we didn't stop and think about the cultural relevance of the word tribe. And that's not to get us off the hook, but it's just, that's what we were doing. We were building things and making things up. And we didn't see the momentum of hundreds of people joining us. And now 52 cities later, the growth of November Project language and the customs and the positivity award and the hugging and the way in which we speak online and the things that are there on the internet forever. We now are at a place where we have to start challenging the model and challenging the things that have become norms. Some things that are really important that'll stick around, and some things that I think need to be readjusted and edited. And that's, I think, where Tribe kind of started. just to give us some context.
We were in Boston. We were two cis white dudes, and we didn't really have the opportunity, or BG, you mentioned cockiness. We were cocky enough and maybe just weren't listening hard enough. There probably have been some members that told us back then, we just weren't listening back then. I think what has changed is many things, but I also think that we're more mature. And again, this is not an excuse, again, just kind of like a historical progression. But we're also, as you said, in 52 locations around the world. And I think that this word means in different locations, different things. And being in 30 plus cities in the United States and being in 10 cities in Canada, where Native population historically has been significantly diminished, and there have been genocides of the Native population, that word carries a massive connotation, again, massive, very strong connotation. And so did it take us too long? Yes, it did. But I'm glad that we had that conversation with all our leaders. One thing I wish that I can take back is go out and publicly make the announcement that we as the organization will stop using that. We made that internal decision. We shared with all our leaders. We stopped using our social media, blogs, etc. But I think if we came out and said it publicly, I think it would be much more meaningful and much more powerful. It would reach more ears. The reason we didn't do it, or at least our reasoning behind it, was that that word just doesn't carry the same meaning in Europe. It doesn't carry the same meaning in Asia. We are a global organization where we'll have the conversations as they come to us. Each set of co-leaders will be having these conversations with their local chapters. I wish we just made kind of like a blanket statement, but a lesson learned.
And we also don't like to half-ass it and stumble and fumble through something. That was a time where we wanted to be polished and right on. And I think we've graduated to this point of being like, well, let's work this stuff out in the open, in the public. And so we didn't have DA and Soumya ready to kind of work with us, work through this process with us. And so, yeah, I mean, now it's to that point where that word is taken out of our vocabulary, and our leaders understand why.
Where we are today is in all our little apartments, pods around North America. We are not preparing to go to Meeting of the Minds, which should have been in like 10 days. First week.
For my calendar, and I was like, oh.
But the work still continues. We're not doing it in person, but the work still continues. So with you two specifically, we are continuing the conversations. We are figuring out a platform or kind of a framework to continue the education of the leaders, and also creating some sort of almost like a knowledge resource for our leaders that may be retiring, that they can take with them, but also the new people that are coming in, they don't feel like they missed out on this work that we've done in the past, so they can kind of absorb some of that information either virtually or through reading. A little bit of peek under the hood. Have you thought about how working with November Project in the future can evolve, or some of the things that you would like to see us do more of?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this last week in regards to the Run with Mod initiative, right? That November Project supported it, made it important in terms of something that they were supporting, but also how can November Project moving forward collaborate or join with other organizations that are predominantly for women of color, for example, right? So how can those collaborations happen? Because as much as I think November Project needs to work on its own stuff around, an awareness around racial justice or social justice more broadly, it's also then how can we collaborate with other organizations who that's their primary focus? Because I don't know that we can pivot on a dime and say like, yes, we're now going to be this kind of organization that is a perfectly racially inclusive and just one, whereas we can say, like, we're this organization, we do certain things really well, and we're going to partner with other organizations who center, say, for example, women of color, because November Project can't claim to do that, but we can certainly partner across with other organizations in that way. I think we talked about kind of the broader idea of what leadership development means, right? Not simply like we need to have rules about diversity and inclusion, but how do you as a leader kind of reflect on yourself, your own identities and your own positionality, and what are the areas for potential growth around being more aware about your own positionality and about your own learning around racial justice or social justice more broadly. So I think those kinds of things are where I see the organization moving on and continuing to grow around. That's kind of how a couple of the things that I've been thinking about.
Last thing that I want to add to what DA said that we talked about last week and in previous weeks is about how can we be accomplices in anti-racist work, not just allies. So how can we not just sit on the sidelines and saying, yeah, that's horrible, but how can we start to disrupt what is happening in our communities and on a global scale? And so on a leadership level, on a member level, providing some tools and resources for people to be able to interrupt in the way that fits for them right now. And like being able to choose that level of discomfort as they're learning. So whether that's reading, whether that's donating, whether that is joining in and partnering, but giving some tools for members and leaders to be able to disrupt in a way that feels, it's conducive to learning. And so that hopefully will be a part of the growing process.
A great segue into what we as a team, as November Project HQ team, has been doing behind the scenes. So we have a little mini book club that we are reading White Fragility, and then we will continue to discuss. We're educating ourselves through podcasts. Some podcasts that I would highly recommend are Pod Save the People or 1619. I think that we will continue to provide resources. I can definitely see having a section on our website for our members to visit, kind of like things to look at, and almost replenished by the community, not just something that we feel people should be reading, but everyone is welcome to chime in. But yeah, I think the first step is looking ourselves in the mirror, recognizing who we are, going back to the identity exercise, and then realizing the privileges that we have, and understand what that does in the society, and then how can we use those things to do good work, and not just sit with our arms crossed, frozen because we're scared or we're afraid or we just don't know what to do.
Well, yeah, and last week, because May is Asian Pacific Islander Month, History Month. And so there was a series on PBS called Asian Americans, which I've just started watching because, I'm neither Asian nor American. So I want to educate myself more on the history of that community in the context of the US. And so it's a 4-part series. It was on PBS. I bet you could probably stream it if you're interested in streaming it. But I'm going to sit down and engage with that material because, again, I need to do more education around that.
Totally. Laura, you want to share as a representative of all parents on this call?
Yes, my voice is for all mothers. No, I think we've had a couple conversations about this, about how, at NP, we're all single. Wayne was married, but he got married when he was like 16 years old. No, it was like so, it was fun, it was young, and it was exciting, and it was like our goals were, and our priorities in life were very different than they are now. Now we're all parents, the 3 of us, and in particular, we have 3 white boys. And I think that there's something that comes with that, a greater responsibility, and maybe that's just my own personal opinion, but for us to kind of, from a very young age, just instill anti-racism and not just be kind, but no, you have to give your friends or people of color a greater voice because you are privileged to more things. And so I think that has taken a personal touch to November Project. We're getting older, but also we kind of see our responsibility as parents, and it kind of bleeds over into like our responsibility over these leaders and making them the best leaders they can be. This is when I just start crying.
Laura never cries.
Boyan's been crying a lot in quarantine, just so you guys know.
No crying in November Project.
Yeah. You're not allowed to cry. No cry.
So November Project is just another one of our babies, and so I think that we take our responsibility almost heavier. I think we're stepping up to the plate more than we have in the past. And
on that note, I would like to wrap this up. Soumya, would you like to share anything? Every show we kind of close with our guests sharing something positive in their lives, something positive in society, because we want to close this on a positive note, not to minimize any of the very important conversation we just covered, but I think 2020 has been a very shitty year, and so we want to take something positive out into the world. So why don't you take it away?
So this is not related to anything we've been talking about, but that is giving me some joy. So there's this playlist that was created by a famous person, and I have listened to it nonstop, so much so that my partner is like, you've ruined every single one of those songs for me now. And so we can probably put that in the link. That seems really important. But that playlist,
This person.
Yes. Well, he created it. It's Lin-Manuel Miranda created this playlist for May. And I was like, why are you going through all of the emotions that I've had in the month of May in this playlist? It's amazing. It's amazing. And so it's given me a lot of life and a lot of joy. So that's mine.
That's great. I was feeling sad last week. I mean, it's pandemic, all the emotions people have. And so I was watching Saturday Night Live at home, and Pete Davidson was wearing a t-shirt with Danny. He did the rap about Danny Trejo and was wearing a t-shirt and a ball cap. And I was like, I need to order this stuff immediately because I love Danny Trejo, the actor. You can't see it. There is his face on my coffee mug. So I ordered a t-shirt, a hat, the coffee that he roasts, and a coffee mug. So that makes me feel much better because Danny Trejo is kind of a cultural icon, actor, Mexican-American. Go watch all of his movies.
Badass.
Yeah. And so I was like, this just made me feel better about, I mean, again, it's a privilege thing. I had the money that I could spend on these products I did not need, but it also made me feel good to support his business. And it fills me with joy just to drink whatever I'm drinking out of this Danny Trejo's coffee mug.
Well, we're going to include a lot of resources in the description of this one. Link to Danny Trejo's business will not be one of them.
That one might go on the bottom of the list. I doubt that's the first. I doubt the Trejo coffee is the first. It might be.
But thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly valuable for the three of us. I hope I speak for BG and Laura. You two are incredible people, incredibly valuable members of November Project, and we truly appreciate all the work you've done leading up to today, and then all the incredible things we'll be doing together in the future.
We love November Project. I mean, it's been important to us as community members, so we're happy to be walking on this journey with you.
Well, thank you so much.